So good morning again, Bioneers. Good morning. Welcome back. And I'm hoping that you're getting ready to begin your day by first hearing from, where are you, Albert? And then talking with what Albert Bates, who I think is one of the most interesting and influential persons in the intentional community and ecovillage movement and appropriate technology as well. So Albert is our first keynote of the day, and he's been the director of the Global Village Institute for over 35 years. And he also is the director for the ecovillage training center at the farm in Summertown, Tennessee, which is a whole systems immersion experience of an ecovillage. And I would venture to guess many of you have heard a little bit about the farm. How many of you know about it? Yeah, I thought so. And I think you might hear more as the day goes on. But I'll bet you don't know a whole lot of other things about who Albert is, so I thought I'd share a few things that I've learned. I found it interesting to learn, for example, that he's an attorney. No longer practicing, I don't think, are you? Wherever you are. But he's argued environmental and civil rights cases before the Supreme Court. That's no small thing. Second, he's the holder of a number of design patents. I had no idea until I looked this up. He invented the concentrating photovoltaic arrays and solar-powered automobile that were displayed in the 1982 World's Fair in Tennessee. Third, this guy's true to my heart because he's about justice. He served on the steering committee of Plenty International, and I just love that, plenty, that word plenty, when most of us are running around thinking about things in a scarcity mode. He's working with a group called Plenty International, which is focusing on the relief and development work with indigenous people, human rights, and the environment. And in 1980, he shared the first Right Livelihood Award because of work with that organization. And many of you learned last year that Vandana Shiva also was awarded that award, and that it really is an alternative Nobel Prize. It's prestigious, it's international, and it honors people like Albert who are working on practical and exemplary solutions to the most urgent challenges facing the world today. Huge, huge accomplishment. And much of the work that he's been doing has been being carried out while he is also organizing ecovillages. He's one of the organizers of the Global Ecovillage Network, a global association of people and communities, and he served both as chairman and president. Now, I think this is interesting because this particular organization is comprised of communities who are dedicated to living what they call sustainable plus. They live sustainable plus lives by restoring the land and adding more to the environment than is taken out. He has taught courses in sustainable design, natural building, permaculture, and technologies of the future to students from over 50 nations. And some of you heard, who were here last night, had an opportunity to know that Albert is also an author, and some of his books include The Biochar Solution, The Post-Petroleum Survival Guide and Cookbook, and Climate in Crisis. His Climate in Crisis book in 1990 was the first book published on web, which is rolled paper, using a 100% recycled product without chemically removing clays or inks. Now, just a little plug for this, we're going to have a book signing at 11:30, and you can purchase all of his books at our bookstore. So, let's welcome Albert, who is going to be with us the rest of the weekend. You'll have an opportunity to have breakfast with him tomorrow morning if you take a look at that in the program and have a one-to-one conversation with him. And let's hear what he has to say, and why he believes that ecovillages are a sound response to climate change. So let's warm round of applause for Albert. I'll get coffee.
That was probably the most comprehensive introduction I can ever remember getting. I confess I don't get to Chicago very often. The matrix is very thick here. But I have a deep family tie here. When my father graduated from college, his first job in 1928 was here, and my mother took a job as his secretary in 1940 and then married the boss here in Chicago. They moved to Hawaii, where I was born, but we moved back here in 1949, and I celebrated my third and fourth birthdays here. So I have roots in this city. But I'm a country boy at heart now, and I'm a long ways from home. And my friend Nicole Foss, with whom I teach permaculture courses, says, all political systems exist to concentrate wealth from the periphery to the center. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about capitalism or socialism or something else. Capitalism is simply more effective at it. Capitalism, like every other industrial economic model, is essentially a Ponzi scheme. We've had the period of boom, and now we're looking at a period of bust. We created the excess claims to underlying real wealth, as she's fond of saying. The cake is baked, and there's no avoiding its consequences. My objective of this talk is to show you a different kind of vision, one based on steady-state economics that can lead us through the present turmoil and get us to a much better world for our children and our grandchildren. Now, Pam alluded to the fact that I had been an attorney for a number of years, and many years ago I was an environmental pit bull fighting bad guys. Eventually I got high blood pressure and decided being a type A individual is probably not suited to my marriage and various other things, so I retired from that. But back when I was busy taking on the nuclear industry and the chemical industry, I was confronted by a problem a little closer to home. That was the plants near us that were making agrochemicals, pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers. And they were injecting their toxic wastes into the aquifer that goes below our farm. And so I looked at that, and as a lawyer, I went and read the Safe Drinking Water Act, and I said, you know, it doesn't say anything here about toxic pollutants. It says no contaminant into a safe drinking water source. And so what's going on here? And I went to protest, and we organized a group, and we filed a lawsuit, and you know, the EPA was actually backing the chemical companies because they felt the deep well injection was better than incineration. Okay, so they were injecting toxic waste into this aquifer that goes all the way from the mountains in the east to the Gulf of Mexico. And the chemical company's essential argument was, you know, we're dumping it a mile down, and nobody's going to go that deep for water. And so I had two arguments to make in 1980. And those arguments were that, first, our population's growing, and that there will be more need for water in the future. And secondly, climate is changing, and that will also accelerate demands on water. And so I was going into a Tennessee court in 1980 trying to persuade the judge that climate change was real. And to do that, I had to troll the various agencies and scientific studies and take subscriptions to various magazines and start talking to experts and trying to line up my ducks to make this proof. And in the process, I did eventually prevail in court. We stopped the industry. We ended deep well injection in Tennessee. And actually, what did it for us was an end run around the whole court process. It was going to elect a new governor for Tennessee. We had, back in the early 80s, some of the highest tech around for people who were writing hardware and software things, making circuit boards out of magazines and creating programs to run them. And we actually developed a system to data mine previous elections to see who voted Republican, who voted Democratic, and then target mailings to the people who were most consistently voting. And we put our services at our choice of future governors, and he won. And then we were on this transition team, and one of the first things we did was to work with the Department of Health and Environment to get deep well injection banned in the state of Tennessee. which actually banned fracking until recently, when the oil and gas lobby came in and said, well, we need an exemption for fracking for oil and gas. And, here in Chicago or in Illinois generally, you could probably buy a state legislature. It might cost you, $1 million or $10 million to buy a legislator. In Tennessee, it's cheap. You can get them for $10,000 or $25,000. Heck, if you give them $1 million, they'd come and engage in unnatural sex in your home. But so, it's not surprising that you're allowed to frack again now. We're completely controlled by a very strange legislature. Well, anyway, in the process, I scared myself. And Pam mentioned this book I wrote. It was a compilation of all of the data I had gotten. Al Gore wrote the foreword to the book. He had provided me a lot of the information. And I discussed the possibility of a runaway greenhouse where 3 degrees would take us to 4, and 4 to 5, and so on. As we pass through these tipping points, each one would trigger a larger one. And from what we're seeing now, from the calathrate bubbles, we're committed to a significant increase. Those tipping points are being crossed. And, I scared myself, and I stayed scared for 20 years. These are some of the images that I drew for the book. And this was almost 30 years ago now. I talked about methane clathrates in the book but didn't chart them. Early this year, that data became alarming as well. I had pictures of the flooding and how it would look in Bangladesh and how it would look in Long Island and New Jersey Shore and Florida and other places as storm events came and changed the coastlines. I talked about all these things, but, you can know about this, and it's a whole other thing to actually experience it. I parked my Mini Cooper at the Nashville airport in 2010 on my way somewhere, and it was not in a flood zone. But when I came back, it had washed down the river. There hadn't been a river there before. I'm not immune. And it was 10 inches of rain in 48 hours. And, we've seen floods in Pakistan and England and Boulder, and hot air holds more water. Ames, Iowa had a 500-year flood in 2010 3 times. So knowing what's coming doesn't necessarily make you exempt or even prepare yourself all that much. The cost of preparation for me is really to build a secure eco-village on the highest ridge between Cincinnati and New Orleans and plant food and construct earth-sheltered, tornado-proof houses there. But we're at the center of the storm there. You may not notice these things if you're living in a city, but if you're deeply embedded in nature, you notice these things. Most farmers get it. And the climate that we have in Middle Tennessee today was not the climate that we had when we started the farm in 1971. That climate is now up somewhere near Lexington, Kentucky. The climate that we have today was down in Neshoba County, Mississippi in 1971. It's been moving about 40 miles per decade. It's now accelerating. It's up to about 70 miles per decade. We know this from changes of when things go into blossom in the spring and when different kinds of migrating insects and birds come. We've changed 2 agricultural planting zones in 40 years. I don't know what else is needed to convince you. Maybe this will help. These are giant Asian hornets. They're in the U.S. and Canada now. They've exploded in recent years due to warm winter and spring weather. Most deaths from these hornets occur when a victim is stung repeatedly and injected with large amounts of venom. The hornet's large size and its ability to, unlike honeybees, to sting multiple times mean that a victim can quickly receive a lethal dose, for instance, if one gets in your shirt. 3 to 4 stings can be fatal, but it would depend on your reaction. They're among the most poisonous insects on Earth. More than 99% of the queens normally die over winter and spring, so small variations in their winter mortality rate can lead to massive differences in the numbers of nests each year. They have no natural predators in North America. They are the top predator, and their main food target is the larvae of other insects, especially bees, which they feed to their own larvae. So you may see these someday soon near you. Ultimately, we will need to find our way to get beyond zero. Carbon neutral will not be good enough. I've been going to UN meetings over the years, and one of the things we see there is these projections. If we wait so long, then we're going to have a steeper decline in emissions in order to stay within 1 degree or 2 degrees of warming. And actually, if you go out past 2030 or thereabouts, you actually have to get into negative emissions. Now, what does that mean? You can't just not emit. You actually have to net sequester. You have to bring more down from the atmosphere and out of the oceans each year than are going there, okay? Well, this is beyond normal scientific disciplines at this point. This is what they're calling in science hyper-wicked problems, because they're cross-cutting and embedded in the culture and the religion and the ways we do things in our society and have for thousands of years. And to become a future society that net sequesters carbon, half of our elected congressmen now say they don't believe in anthropogenic climate change. And they think the United Nations is a one-world conspiracy. Their scientific literacy, as well as those of our children, is declining. So all of these problems are entangled, and to address them effectively will require quantum enlargement of frame analysis and complexity science and meme science and cultural value assessments, social media measurement, neurographics, perception analysis to develop frameworks to quantify the relationship dynamics that drive collective action. And we're a long way from even understanding what I just said. And time is closing in. And the physical world is imposing its own rules, which are actually pretty simple. So all of this is quite scary, and you would have to say that our chances of getting out of this without going extinct are really pretty slim, which is what I thought. And then, and I went through this sort of period of deep depression, and I call it my Houston moment, not because of Houston, we have a problem, but because of I was in Houston, Texas the moment I had this, which is we're fracked. And maybe it was already blown before I was born. Maybe this was already set in motion to the point where there was no recovery back then. So when you get to that realization, what can you possibly do? And my sense has been that if there's a little bit of hope, an ember of hope, I'm going to blow on it and try to start a fire. And really, for my own sanity, the only thing I can do is to try to do something. To try to, if I'm in a sinking boat, I'm going to start bailing even if it's hopeless. And then I happened to go to a permaculture conference in Brazil, which gave me some real hope. And for the first time, I saw the Amazonian dark earths, and I started to inquire how they came into being. And that led me to the story of Francesco de Orellana and the world that he saw when he came to the Americas and was the first to travel down the Amazon River, was different than portrayed by historians and anthropologists until very recently. It was not a savage world, but one as developed as Europe at that time. And so I went to the textbooks. Actually, I was greatly benefited. The book that Orellana's, his journals of his travels, he had a faithful Dominican scribe named Gaspar de Carvajal. And his journey in 1542 had been daily chronicled, but it was in medieval Spanish. It had never been translated into English, but thanks to Google Books, it was available from the collection at the Library of Sevilla. And thanks to Google Translator, you can actually run it through a Spanish translator and get a reasonable approximation. And if you know a little bit about Spanish, you can translate the medieval Spanish words. So using that, I was able to actually get a picture of what he saw. And it's an interesting story because he saw this world, and then he went back to Spain, and he told the king, and they financed the second voyage, and he traveled up the Amazon this time from the Atlantic instead of coming down from Ecuador, and he was hit by a poison arrow about 2 weeks in and died, and that was the end of that voyage, and no other Europeans arrived for another 50 years. And what happened in that 50 years, Charles Mann describes it as entire cultures hissed away like steam. Because of the first contact, the diseases spread like virus through the American peoples, and they did not have any immunity to the European diseases. And there was something like a 95% kill. This is an area of some dispute among scholars, but in the Amazon basin, it was around 95%, which means, all of art, all of culture, all of literature, all of history, everything that you have in your culture disappears. And tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people died. Some 250 domesticated species of crops were lost forever. We know this from pollen records. Consensus view was that back in Spain, they said Orellana was a liar, that what he saw was crazy, that his journals were just reports of a madman, and so they were deep sixth. Then they wound up in the library of Sevilla, where they just sat in cobwebs. Well, one of the things that you started to see was these reports of the Black Earths, that the basis for this rich, deep civilization that had mechanical machinery with moving parts, that had large ships that were docked along long wharf fronts in front of cities on the riversides, and the cities extended for many kilometers inland, gleaming white in the distance, and wide causeways and things like that were in his reports. And they all, vanished back into the jungle after people disappeared. And was that the basis for that civilization was its agriculture, was its ability to feed large populations, and they had these rich earths. And as I read it, I began to understand there's two man-made objects that are visible with the unaided eye if you're standing on the moon. One is the Amazon rainforest, and the other is the Sahara Desert. The two worlds collided at the Columbian encounter. European agriculture, which comes from the Fertile Crescent, northern China, northern Africa, is based on extraction. It's based on irrigation and the plow. And everywhere that began, today there are deserts. In the New World, agriculture was based on building soil. And everywhere that the populations were the densest, the soils were the deepest. This was an amazing discovery, and it's only just recently come to light in the last 2 decades, 3 decades. But it was based on agroforestry, holistic management, pasturage practices, and biochar. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this because we need this, and we need a permaculture army to make the switch, which is what I do. I train up that army. Researchers have uncovered this evidence that supports now this idea that urban societies were based around agriculture. And we know that after the depopulation and large-scale abandonment of the cities of the Americas and their subsequent reforestation, that it sequestered a huge amount of carbon from the atmosphere in a very short amount of time. In decades or centuries, it lowered the temperature of Europe to the point where they had a little ice age, and Louis XIV had to put parquet floors on the palace in Versailles to keep his feet warm, and the Swedes invaded Denmark over the ice, and Hans Brinker won the silver skates on the frozen canals. All of that as a result of this sudden sequestration of massive gigatons and gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere. A similar experience happened when Genghis Khan invaded to the east, or to the west. Actually, it wasn't Khan himself. He divided the Mongol Empire among his 4 sons, and from 1235 to 1241, they conquered most of Eastern Europe from the Urals as far east as Vienna, far west as Vienna, and then extending the empire to the east through Siberia. And they exterminated the populations in many places. They were not nice people. And so there was a regrowth of forests similar to what we saw in the 15th and 16th centuries in the Americas. And it absorbed about 700 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere, which equaled the amount of carbon that global society now produces annually from gasoline. So why was the Amazon so fertile? This is, why Henry Ford went and set up Fordlandia to grow rubber there. How did it manage to become so deeply fertile there at the equator where it had been millions of years since the last glaciation? And the foreign invaders exploited these qualities, but they didn't really explain the phenomena. And it wasn't until a young man named Wim Sombroek, a Dutch soil scientist, arrived in the late 90s, actually he got there in the 60s as part of a UN exploration, but he didn't really explain it until the 90s. And he did all of these analyses of the soils there, and he saw something in the digs, in the archaeological digs of the soils that reminded him of something, because Wim Sombroek was born during the Second World War, and he remembered the Hongerwinter of 1945-1946, when the European allies had not yet fully normalized in Europe, and so you had not enough food for the population. And he remembered his father in Holland going out to the garden with the cinders from his fireplace and putting them in the garden to help grow tomatoes and things in the spring. And then he was in these digs looking at pottery shards coming out of the earth, and he noticed charcoal. And he said, aha, this is like the plug-in soils of Holland. The charcoal was used by the peoples to create fertility in their landscape, in their garden. And that is what we are today calling biochar. We haven't thought about this very much, but charcoal, what does it really do if you add it to soil? Biochar is actually a word that we're using because charcoal is a misleading term. You can get it in the hardware store, you can get it in the grocery store for your barbecue, but it might have petroleum additives to make it ignite quickly and last a long time. And in fact, that's not what you want to put in your garden. So biochar refers to charcoal that's suitable for putting into a food system. It doesn't have contaminants. And so the proposed definition is a solid carbonaceous material which is produced by the burning in the absence of oxygen. And what this does is it drives off all of the components other than the carbon. All of the volatile gases go off and get burned. And then what's left behind is hard carbon. And it's actually a crystalline kind of matrix of carbon. It's a very strong bond. It doesn't break down very easily. It doesn't become free carbon that's taken up by the plants. It's more like a soil structure carbon. And if you look at it under a microscope, you see what the value to the garden is because it's porous. It has this pore structure that's created by the cell structure of the plant, but it's also pitted with the gases as they expand in the fire. And so there are pores on the walls of the pores. And if you look down with a good enough microscope, you see pores on the walls of the pores of the walls. It's fractal. It's turtles all the way down. And so there you have, it depends on what kind of plants you started with or, what the temperatures were and different kinds of factors. But you get this porous structure. Well, if you're a soil microbe, if you're a bacteria or a fungi or a non-parasitic nematode or a microarthropod, you come into this structure and you see this and say, wow, a condo. I'm going to move my whole family in, And it's got high cation exchange, which essentially means the walls are magnetic for certain kinds of minerals. And so it's like painting the walls with an adhesive paint. And so as the nutrients get brought into this coral reef, they stick. And they stay there in that reef, and then the microbes, the bacteria, draw them on demand, and they provide particular nutrients on demand to the roots of the plants through the soil food web. So that's the beneficial effect. And if you're around for a little while and you start to study these, very quickly, as soon as the charcoal hits the ground, it immediately gets populated. And you see the fungi come in. And you see these bacteria start to fill the cavities and bring in their food sources. And the diversity skyrockets through the roof. This is a DNA chart of a biochar soil reef. And just the diversity it expands exponentially very quickly. And, it's kind of like a Star Wars cafe down there. E.O. Wilson says if he were advising a student today what to study and goes to just going into science, what should you study? He says study soil, because this is the future. And this is one of the things we know the least about. But there are millions, billions of species that have not yet been identified. And they all have roles to play. And they transfer nutrients in various forms, soluble, insoluble, accessible, not so accessible, into the roots of the plants for the plants to use in forms that they can use them. And so immediately what you see is if you have poor soil and you add biochar to it, the plants begin to grow much better. You get much stronger photosynthesis. There's available nutrients on demand. This is actually not entirely new. We had textbooks back in the mid-19th century that said put charcoal on your tomato plants, put them on your peppers, put them on your turnips, and they'll do wonders. And this was fairly common. And with the advent of the Haber-Bosch process in the 1930s and artificial ammonium fertilizers, suddenly all of this knowledge was no longer needed. So 2 different kinds of carbon, and the kind that normally goes through the carbon cycle is about a 12-year cycle. A plant dies, it decays in the earth, it off-gasses to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide or methane, and that travels, through the sky for a while. Maybe some of it gets rained down into the oceans, some of it gets rained back to the land, and then gets taken up by the plants again and becomes next year's stalks and leaves and so forth. Well, that's the normal labile carbon cycle, typically 10, 12, 15 years. There's another kind of carbon, which is if you char something, then that forms a very hard bond, and it doesn't break down for perhaps 1,000 years. It stays in the soil, not as food, but as structure. And it's an open structure. You just saw the porous part of it, the pores, and so now you've got the potential to hold water like a sponge or air, and aerobic bacteria love that. So you have the carbon capacity to begin to do this structural effect. And if you look at the carbon reservoirs where they exist in the earth and in the water and in the oceans and so forth, let's take a small exercise. It's an exercise in holistic thinking. So you're going to be to think like a piece of Gaia's new neocortex. You have 4 organs that you're balancing for carbon, and nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and other elements too. And you have to keep them all in balance. But let's start with carbon now. Fossil fuel combustion will release 30 billion tons of carbon dioxide this year. If that was phased out over 40 years on a straight line basis, a total of 580 billion tons would still be released before emissions stop completely by 2050, say. Deforestation is releasing 7 billion tons a year. If it proves possible to stop that in 10 years, it will add 35 billion tons to the atmosphere by 2020. If we ignore other releases from the way we use and abuse the land, including methane from cattle, and we keep those, and we keep the rice we grow, and the nitrous oxide from fertilizers we apply, we're looking at adding another 615 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere by mid-century, even with an incredibly aggressive emissions mitigation program. Now, that's 615 billion tons of carbon dioxide that'll have to be removed together with the excess carbon dioxide that's already up there. So suppose we take 350 parts per million as our initial target, as James Hansen and others suggest. At present, 2.9 trillion tons of carbon dioxide are in the air. So reducing its concentration from 400 to 350 means we have to take about 300 billion tons out. Okay, so these are our best options. And low, we can find that we can get our 8 to 10 gigatons of carbon from these wedges. This is how much per year you can get out using carbon farming, like Vandana Shiva suggests, emissions reductions, like the UN's working so hard to accomplish, afforestation, reforestation, and biochar. And afforestation, reforestation is a big one. So plant trees, grow fruit trees, grow nut trees, change the city trees to things that produce food, that kind of thing. These are our best options, and we can find that we can get it, but we have to work in coordinated ways. And can we be sure that they will work? One of the things I learned in the process of experimenting and taking what I learned in Brazil back to the farm in Tennessee and starting to make biochar and put it in my garden was that there's an important piece that they don't often tell you about, which is that actually if you just put charcoal in your garden for the first year or two, the plants will probably do worse. Why is that? Well, it's because they need to fill up all those rooms in the condo with the bacteria and the nematodes and all their nutrients. So they're stealing all of that from the garden to fill up the soil reef. And what you need to do first, actually, is put the charcoal in your compost pile. And then it fills up with everything that's needed for the garden. And then you put it in the garden, and suddenly you get this beautiful growth. Everything does wonderfully. So we started doing this at the farm, and then we got into compost teas. Now, compost teas is a whole other step. So instead of just the compost, which is very rich in nutrients, we want to get the biology amped up. So we want to get all of those bacteria and fungi, all the aerobic kinds that are really good for gardens, all going really strong before we get them into the garden. And so to do that, we brew them in aerobic water at a particular warm temperature, and we get them going really strong over about a 24-hour period, and then we put that in the garden. So I got a little video here I want to show you. This is our latest stuff that we've been doing in that department. You're about to watch a video so sexy that it should be X-rated. This is a revolution disguised as organic gardening. The sex is going on right in front of the camera. You just need a microscope to watch it.
So what we start with is basically just water. You bubble it for 24 hours to get all the chlorine out of it. And then you add micromate from Mesa Verde, which is basically humate and fulvic acids to help lock up the leftover chlorine, drop it to the bottom, and then you're ready to fill your bag and put it in the water. And your bag consists of different types of soils, worm castings, bat guano. Those are the types of ingredients you want to add to the bag. Within the 24 hours of brewing process, you want at least a third of that bag to exit into the water. And then you're going to add fish hydrolysate as your micro meal, and that's going to get the fungi and the bacteria all fed and active and ready to go. And then I also sometimes add kelp. That's, if depending on your application, kelp is a good one. Feather meal, if you have that available.
Feather meal, what's that, broken up feathers? I ground up feathers from poultry?
I actually don't use feather meal yet. I stick with kelp, micromate, and fish hydrolysate. Those are my main ingredients. But I also use worm castings in almost every batch I do, and I use bat guano.
Have you ever used biochar?
I have used biochar. I've used your biochar. I've I'm working on getting more into biochar. But the first year we did biochar, we didn't grind it up enough and we blew pumps. So this year we're getting it a little bit better down. And
so you soak it in the tea bag.
Soak it in the tea bag.
And that way only the fine stuff gets into the
Exactly. And then you can use that tea bag to put wherever and re-inoculate compost piles, re-inoculate anything. It'll help break it down. You can go bury that biochar around your yard, and that'll get the longevity of the biochar rather than just spreading it straight on the ground. You'll get many, many more years out of it. But the slurry type biochar is also very, very effective. That's what I'm trying to get into, is ground up slurry actions.
This area was left as a brownfield after construction of the new building, and the construction crews really tore it up, pouring cement here, bringing in cranes and so forth. What is left is just clay subsoil, loose gravel, and broken concrete. There is zero topsoil. This will be a real test of the compost tea because all we are doing is spraying and then seeding with a shade-tolerant grass mix and mulching with straw. We'll have to come back in a month and show the after picture of what happened here. We sprayed the roofs in the evening just before dark, before cutting them back with a trimmer and machete the next morning. Early that day we cut the wet foliage and laid it down as a mulch over the thin soils. Then we came back and put on a soaker hose to keep the roof moist and to make the most favorable environment for the added biological conditioning. There's carbon in the ground, much more than in the atmosphere. Most of it is in carbon compounds that soil organisms and plants use as nutrients and give back to us as oxygen and food. If we want to stop global warming, we need to hold more of that carbon in soil organisms and the residues of those organisms for the longest possible time, whether it's residues in the form of humus, which is a very stable carbon compound, or whether it's plant residues like leaf litter, grass clippings, and mulch that reduce evaporation. We're trying to increase the retention time of carbon in its solid form in the land for as long as possible, as opposed to allowing it to become gaseous, because that's when it becomes a dangerous greenhouse gas. That's what carbon farming, or what my friend Darren Doherty calls regrarianism, is all about. It's about changing the soil to help heal the atmosphere. This is agriculture that builds rather than mines the soil, and can turn Earth back into a garden planet.
So I don't know how many people here are familiar with epigenetics, but it involves the choices that an organism can make from a range of available genes that are there when they are doing cell division. So the RNA molecule can actually choose from available gene pool that's available to make particular next phase of the organism. So if it's bacterium, it can be a bacterium that specializes in a particular area because the gene pool was available in the choice when the organism was dividing. So if we have soil minerals and we have a wide range of them, and then we have bacteria and fungi, they can choose and they can become what's needed for the roots of, or what's demanded by the roots of particular plants. If you have stress from a drought or you have different soil deficiencies, you can begin to redress those if you have the available gene pool that's there that the bacteria and the fungi can choose from. So we saw that diversity slide of all the DNA and how it explodes in a bacterial coral reef. Well, if we can do that, then we can create these systems for making better plant growth and photosynthesis. The plants themselves store more nutrients. If you're talking about food plants, they become more nutritious. They become more nutrient dense. They have a wider array of nutrients. And so that same epigenetic effect happens in your gut. When you absorb all of that nutrient availability, you're also absorbing a lot of bacteria. You are made up of a huge amount of bacterial DNA, each and every one of you. And so you have all of that available, and as you do food preparation, you're adding in more. You know, if you have beer or bread or pickles or any number of things, you're using fermentation, and what's that? That's bacteria. That's different processes to create more available life forms that you're ingesting. And so now that's available to you through the nutrient process as you absorb it, and your gut bacteria goes in stages and it does various different things to process all of that and draw nutrients out of it. So we're looking at more nutrient-dense foods available, and we don't have to have so much in bulk, and we don't have to become quite so large as humans because we have more nutrient density in our food. And so we can then also save what comes out of us as human manure, and that then goes back to the garden and the whole process repeats. This is the agriculture of the Americas. This is the agriculture that we give to the world. It was a whole systems in which the nutrients were returned to the places where they originated rather than exported upriver or across an ocean or by rail or by large semi-tractor trailers to some distant city and then wind up in the sewage treatment plant, which goes into the river. No, it's going back to the fields. It's actually recycling back. And so the takeaways essentially for me are that you have this whole soil food web that is the basis of our life. And we need to think about this in biological terms, not chemical terms. We've been reducing everything, Liebig's law of moving everything to the, what's the critical elements that we need to get into our diet or into our food supply or so forth. No, what we really need to think about are what are the critical biology factors that make for resilience in the ecosystems, make for the possibility of having really good food and to supply large civilizations. Okay, then the next question is, how do we get buy-in? How do we get people to actually go for this system over the existing systems that are so heavily sponsored by industry and governments? And my concept is to look at this, what I'm calling cool food, and hoping to create as a cool food movement. Examples, this is the largest CSA in Europe, the largest subscription agriculture system. 25,000 subscribers buy from this one farmer. And he has a biochar producing heating kiln, which also has a Stirling engine on it. So it produces 5 kilowatts or 25 kilowatts of power. And then it produces all of the electricity needed for the fans and the lights and everything else in his farm, pumps and whatnot. And then he also produces heat that keeps his greenhouses going all through the winter. So he has a 4-season harvest for all of his subscribers. And he's making biochar. So the biochar then goes back into his plants, which then become nutrient dense. So if you look at problems that they've been having in Japan as the population ages there, the Satayama, which literally means second nature, was the area outside of the farms that where farmers would go to get bamboo or hunt or various other things. And now there's not enough young farmers. They've all gone off to the city, and the old farmers don't use the Satayama as much. And so it's become overgrown, and the wild boars come and they ravage the rice paddies. And so a group of farmers banded together in the Hozu Farmer Co-op, and they created a biochar making system where they would harvest the bamboo out of the Satayama to keep the wild boars from growing too much. And then they would turn that into biochar, put it into their fields. And then they started branding the food. So they were growing cabbages made in biochar, and they knew that they were net sequestering carbon in the process. So they called it cool food, and they sold mixes of cool slaw in the stores at a slight premium, and they sold out. And so they surveyed the buyers of these things, and they found that the consumers were largely families that had children, and the children were telling their parents, buy this, it will help save the planet. And in fact, they started marketing then to children by having cartoons and comic books and things talking about Mr. Biochar and the things that he does in the garden and how you can carbon sequester while having higher nutrient density in your food. So this is a whole systems model for industry to be able to look at cool products, right? So Craig Sams, who founded Greens and Blacks, is now in Belize. He's working with the Toledo Cacao Growers Organic Association that's making organic chocolate. And they're taking the cacao pods, which is a waste product of the industry, putting it into kilns and making biochar that goes back into the cacao orchards to make the cacao orchards more resilient and nutrient dense. And then they're making charcoalate. Cesar Velez in Mexico doing the same thing with making agave, and he's producing what in the future may be called charquilla. So that's cool foods. Now also think about cool fuels. We have the possibility here. This is the village. It's an eco-village in Ireland, and they have district heating, Ireland's first eco-village, 30 homes in a village and 20 more in the adjoining older village. And what they want to do is replace Polish coal, which is the traditional Irish way of heating their homes, and endangered peat with a facility that takes 40 acres of pelletized biomass annually. Well, if they put in and switch over their boilers, and they're working with the European Commission to get a grant to do this, and make biochar using a pyrolytic instead of an oxidizing burn, they can actually reduce their demand for pellets by 30%. And so they use less acreage every year to make the biomass. And they can actually work it from waste crops, waste stubble from corn and wheat and so forth, and sawdust from sawmills and other kinds of waste products that, if left on their own, would become carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or methane. So they're using the biochar that they would produce from, and they're already producing biochar, from home and community gardens throughout County Tipperary. And they contract with local farmers, and they return a lot of the biochar to them. So here's a way that you can actually do this, making your own biochar stove that you can put into your wood stove. If you have a wood burner or a wood heater, you just have to make a cylinder, puncture some holes so that the gases can escape, have a tight-fitting lid. I put a screw on one end, and then I have an eyelet on the other end so I can lift it out of the fire when it's hot. I fill it with bamboo. I throw it in my wood stove. I make biochar, and then it gases, and you see the little blue jets coming out of the side of the stove. And then you know that it's making gas, and it's also producing charcoal. And then as soon as the blue gas stop, then I know that it's done. I take it out. I cool it off, throw it out in the snow, bring it back in, unscrew it, put in more bamboo, and start it again. I'm using less biomass. I'm using waste products, sawdust, cardboard, things that I can't use that would otherwise decay or be burned in a landfill, and then take that and then make biochar, which then goes into my garden in the spring. Okay, let's add something. Let's add another element to that. After Hurricane Sandy, the BioLite company started using these on various street corners in Brooklyn and Flatbush and the Jersey Shore to charge up people's cell phones. This is a biochar making stove, and it makes biochar instead of ash. Burns cleanly, uses a third less fuel. It's a gasifying stove. You can make your tea or your Knorr soup mix or whatever you're going to make on it. And while you're doing that, it's charging a battery because there's a thermocouple inside the container, and so it charges a battery. And then you have a fan that's running, and when it gets to a certain point, the light goes green. You can open this up, and you've got a USB charging port. So you can charge up your laptop or your iPad or your cell phone. And, you know, maybe you're backpacking and you can watch Netflix at night on the mountaintop. So we can scale this up. This is a company in California, in Berkeley, that's making them on a pallet that can go. This is a whole house size unit that you can have that would power an average house. How do you translate this to the two-thirds world where they're not going to be able to afford these kinds of fancy little first world devices? Well, Dorcel Torres from Cornell went to start working in Kenya, and she started noticing that they have the three-stone fire in most homes, dirt floor, and it's a huge impact because the children inhale soot their entire childhood. 8 million cases of inhaled soot pneumonia. More people die of that than die of malaria. And what can you do to replace those with clean gasifying cook stoves if you can't afford to buy these fancy little devices from Italy or France or someplace? Well, here's the answer. You make a biochar stove, which is essentially a two-chamber stove. The inner chamber is baking the biomass. The exterior chamber is your ignition source. And then you make your biochar, and then when you're done with the biochar, where does it go? It goes out to the garden. So in Africa, they have typically very poor soils. Now you can begin to rebuild those soils. You can take it back to the way they were 8,000 years ago and reverse European agriculture through American agriculture. And I say American not in the sense of the USA. Thank you. So, we're using these BC Machina in Guatemala and Belize to try to grind the biochar to get it down to the size that an earthworm could digest. Goes in the front of the earthworm, comes out the back filled with earthworm castings and good bacteria from the earthworm gut. And then it can go into the garden that way. There are large-scale operations such as the biochar engineering company of Golden, Colorado that sells this mobile unit. They sold 2 of these to the North Carolina Forestry Department for after the beetle blight that they had that killed all the pine trees in the Appalachians. They went in and charred all of that down wood and reduced the forest fire risk and also put it right there into the ground, which makes the future generations of trees more resistant to beetle disease and more drought-proof and more able to withstand the climate changes. We're doing these camps at the farm called the Biochar Stove Camps to help people to make their own stoves and to learn how gasification stoves work. We're also doing carbon farming courses. I'm now calling them climate farming courses. And we've got this model built to where we're doing these courses with other people providing them all over the world, in the Caribbean, in Costa Rica, and other places. My thrust that I try to tell people is what we really want to do is get these so that they're not just one process. You're using that heat, you're using that product, and you're passing it through many stages. In permaculture, we call this multiple yields or stacked yields. So you have water treatment with the charcoal. Then you have a silage conditioner where that same charcoal goes into the silage to prevent bad toxins and fungus from coming in. And then you have digestive supplements. So it goes into the cows through the silage. And it helps their 7 stomachs to digest properly. And then you have a litter amendment. It's going into their manure, which is going into the barn, and then it has going into a manure conditioner, which becomes a soil amendment, which sequesters the carbon. I'll mention cool houses because now I'm getting to the stage where I want to talk about eco-villages. And cool houses are like, okay, straw bale. And we want to replace these subdivisions with, which are energy intensive, with buildings that have low embodied energy, cob, earth bags, ways of building with nature using natural materials that do not require a mortgage to build with, that anybody can learn to do with the ground beneath their feet and the things that grow around them. And you can begin to make these climate ready. So you have living roofs. And we can see this in urban settings as well, the use of living roofs to sequester carbon, provide temperature control, and various other good features. This is actually one of the techniques that was used many centuries back in underground cities in Turkey and other places to live in ways that are earth-sheltered. So this is Earth Haven community in North Carolina, earth-sheltered and tree-sheltered to reduce the need for heating and air conditioning by using natural elements in the landscape. We're actually now experimenting with putting biochar into wall plasters. What does it do? It draws mold spores out of the air and sequesters them in the reef in the wall and actually cleans the air. So it's biobiology. It actually is healthy building syndrome. And you have a healthy bacterial environment living in the walls that's processing your air every day and making it better for you. So this is a wine cellar in Switzerland where they're putting in to reduce mold in the cellar. This is what I'm starting to call economics. You put it all together, you have things that heat and cool and provide you businesses and give you opportunities to grow food in all different settings. You can have products that you sell. You can, if eventually, sell the carbon credits, but even before that, you have electricity that you can sell. You have heat that you can sell. You can take fees for recycling wastes. All of these things go into a business plan. This is now becoming what we call the eco-village vision, because I think Pam mentioned the idea of sustainability plus, and this is a big part of what we talk about. It's the quintessentia of eco-village. The earliest eco-village that we know of is Solheimur in Iceland, started in 1930 by a woman named Cecilia Sigmundsdóttir. She's now on an Icelandic postage stamp. Cecilia was fortunate enough to buy a farm that had a hot well. It produced hot water at almost 12 gallons per second at almost boiling temperatures. And so with that, she built greenhouses, and today they are reforesting Iceland from that eco-village, making more than 1 million trees a year, putting back the trees that the Danes and others took away in centuries to make charcoal for European stoves. They're reforesting Iceland with geothermal power. Note the living roofs on all of those buildings. Dominor in Italy is a federation of eco-villages in the Vidraccio Valley in northern Italy, and they're reestablishing the old cultures of cheese and wine and other kinds of good things. Sarvodia in Sri Lanka, 18,000 eco-villages in their network. They have a self-help pay-it-forward program where one village adopts another and tries to bring that village up to the same living standards as the first village. So wealthy villages have an obligation to adopt poorer ones and bring them up to the same basic standards. You have Japan is probably the newest member of the Eco-Village Network. They have different kinds of cuisine. They're exploring perennial grasses to make udon noodles and things to create new ways of living in Japan. This is quite a challenge given Fukushima. At the farm in Tennessee, we talk about the three-legged stool. So you have to be ecologically sustainable. You have to be sustainable from the standpoint of social dynamics. You have to be able to live with each other in ways that are egalitarian and transparent and so forth. But also, you need to be economically sustainable, something that's often overlooked. One of our businesses at the farm is making Geiger counters. So I've been monitoring the rainfall here the last couple of days. I always travel with one of our Geiger counters. And, we've been working with different organizations over the years. This is not something that you come born with. You have five senses, and you need a prosthetic device to detect radiation. So this is sort of our way of having right livelihood within the farm. Recently, we've been providing them through ground source networks in Japan that have been monitoring the radiation from Fukushima and putting it out into cell phone networks and GPS tracking and so forth, mapping. And that's how it is they discovered toxic schoolyards and things. So the farm today, another major thing we're doing is sequestering carbon through our footprint. We have grown from an original 750-acre purchase in 1971 to more than 5,000 acres under management today. You can see us from 100 miles up in space. And most of that is zoned for human exclusion. We are looking at biodiversity as a major goal. And our forest is now sequestering 5 times more than our footprint, so we are carbon negative as an eco-village. This is what I see as the future, is carbon negative villages and settlements around the world, each of them sequestering more than they actually produce. And we're giving workshops now in China with the Global Eco-Village Network and Gaia University to create future designs in China which provide trainings in how to build villages of this kind. So this is our idea, to de-link growth from well-being, to do it immediately and not wait. You have to ask, how do people evolve? How does society change? It changes by example. It changes by carrot, not stick. Sticks always have a reverse blowback effect. Carrots, on the other hand, create permanent change. You look at how others are doing things and you learn and say, I would like to live that way. I would like to do things that way. In Africa, one of our eco-village projects in Senegal is now working with the United Nations and the Global Environmental Facility to plant trees. They're working to set up an international accord across Africa where they're going to plant trees all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean and to slowly roll back the Sahara Desert going from south to north. They're working with, they have an eco-village network in Senegal now that has a ministry for eco-villages in the government and a minister of eco-villages in the government of Senegal with a goal of 18,000 eco-villages by the end of this decade in Senegal to do this tree planting work. So this is our vision. This is how we work. And this is the real wealth. The real question, the only question I have left is, how do we get fast buy-in? How do we get more people to do this quickly? And my sense of it is that we need to make it a viral meme that spreads very infectiously, a fungal meme. And we need to have, if we can get Japanese schoolgirls to do it and like it, I think that's kind of the way of the future. And so it has to be cool. And so I'm talking about cool villages, coolnomics, cool foods, cool fuels, cool energy systems. If we could get, devices that could go in every home and every backpack, this would be the way to do it, And so cool living. And if you all come down and visit us at the Ecovillage Training Center at the farm, I'll happy to show you some of what we're doing. We do the next permaculture course I'm teaching is in Belize. There's still openings in the class. You're welcome to come. This is next February. It's a 2-week course. You travel upriver for an hour in a dugout canoe to get there. You're there in the Maya Mountain Farm for a week or 2 weeks, and you eat everything there is from the local area, and you get to study permaculture with Mayan villagers. So please join us.
So, Albert, we have time for just a couple questions. So if we could have maybe 2 questions and before we move forward. And I know because you're here the rest of the weekend, you'll make yourself accessible to people, yes?
Sure. I'll
Okay.
be signing books after this.
Yeah, you'll be signing books. I'm not going to forget to mention that again. Okay, does anybody have a question they want to ask right now before we move forward?
Have you been to agricultural training schools like Kansas State University?
Yeah, she asked if I've been to agricultural training schools, and the answer is yes. My mother actually is a graduate of Iowa State and Ames, and they have a very good program there now in doing these kinds of experiments. David Laird is the principal, and so I've been there to Iowa State, and I think that a lot of universities, if you just do a Google search on Google Scholars for research on biochar, you see that there's about 20 to 50 papers out every single month, and that those are coming from universities that have agricultural departments that are extremely interested in this kind of stuff. So I'm just somebody who's popularizing it, but actually there's a whole range of scholarly work that's being done that's first rate right now.
Thank you.
Hi, I've got the mic. Am I next? Can I make biochar in a little fire pit in my backyard?
You can. There are several different methods, and I would just say go on YouTube. Every week there's more being posted. I saw a method last week of making it from pine cones on wet newspaper. Wow. So you just put dry pine cones on a wet piece of newspaper. You can put it on a table. You can put it indoors. And you drop a match, the pine cones go, and then when they get black, before they go down to ash, you just hit them with water, and you've got biochar. And the wet newspaper keeps it from damaging your counter or your table.
You talked about increasing the nutrient value of food. Talk a little bit more, if you would. How do you measure that? What does it mean? I've never heard the term before.
The epigenetics. This is about having available minerals also in your soils in soluble forms that the plants can uptake. And a lot of soils have that, but it's locked away in ways that can't be accessed easily. And so by breaking that down, having the right microorganisms present in the soil, you get a nutrient release from soil, and actually adding compost and other things brings in more nutrient. And then that gets into the plant. Okay, so now the plant becomes nutrient dense. How do you measure that? It's a spectrographic analysis primarily, but you can do it. And then you can see the improvement in nutrient availability in food generally from having a good soil biology to begin with.
I think we need to move on.
Okay.
One last one? Okay.
What can city dwellers, people who live in condos or apartments here in Chicago, do to be involved in the biochar movement?
I would say get your city engineers involved in looking at this, and where do the steam plants here get their fuels, and how do they process them, and can you find waste sources for biomass that could be turned into biochar that can go back into the earth to make Chicago the first carbon-negative city in the world. I think that's what has to happen. It may be a political thing. Maybe a mayor could run on this. But the idea is that you could do this. There's no technological barrier to doing this. They studied the continent of Australia. They said for biochar to ramp up there in maximum optimal ramp-up mode, 2 sources would provide all of the fuel stock they needed. One was paper mill wastes, and the other was chicken litter from poultry farms. So, you can find waste streams that are already going into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide or methane and convert those into biochar that's going to grow into the ground.
So it appears as though we're going to have time for a couple more questions since we're waiting for John Michael Greer. So how about this side? Anybody over on this side of the room?
Yeah, I had a question. Is there a minimum temperature that you have to heat the biological material to make it recalcitrant? And what size is the size that is able to go through an earthworm?
Yeah. You got two of the three most commonly asked questions. You know what the third one is? How much should I put on my land? So I'll answer all three. First, what size? The optimal size is the size an earthworm can digest, which is, talking micron size. And to get it to a fine powder without getting black lung yourself is a challenge. And I've tried different techniques, putting it in a bucket, putting it in a sack in a bucket, hitting it with a wooden mallet, crunching it down, and that was a lot of work. And then I have a solar-powered golf cart that I drive around the farm. So I threw it in a gunny sack, put it out in my driveway, ran over a few times with the golf cart. That was a lot easier. It did leave a black spot on the driveway. What we're doing lately is what I showed in the slide of BC Machina, which is the same machine they're using to make cacao from fermented cacao pods to usable chocolate. And also grind other kinds of things, like it's a molino, so it grinds corn into masa. But it's a recumbent bicycle, so you're getting your exercise while you're making your biochar the right size, right? So that's the size question. What was the second one? Temperature of kiln. Okay, so 400 to 700 degrees is what they call slow burn temperature. You can go 1,000 degrees or more. I'm talking Celsius here. You can go 1,000 degrees or more. You get different effects at different temperatures and different substrates. So you're talking pine has a different effect than oak. Grasses have a different effect than trees. And some are going to be alkaline, some are going to be acid. What's your soil? Does your soil need a liming agent, or what does it need? And so you can remediate your soil and get your soil to the right neutral pH by what temperature and what substrate you're using to make your biochar. And at lower temperatures, slower cooks, you get more and bigger pores. At higher temperatures and faster cooks, you get more polished surfaces and fewer pores. So more porosity happens in the 400 to 700 degree range. Okay, then the third question, which you didn't ask, is how much do I put on my garden or my field? And the answer there is as much as you can afford. Because actually, it's hard to buy now. It's a chicken and egg kind of thing. You can't go into a garden store because they don't have it. You got to make it yourself. There are people coming out with batches, and they're starting to sell, and they're mixing them with worm castings already, or mixing them with compost and selling them in bags. Biocharm is one brand. Soil Reef is another brand. You can ask your garden store to get this for you. They would love to do it. And then that helps speed the process of getting it out. But then also you can make it yourself, and that's the way most people do. You can't have too much, in my view, because they're using it as a substitute for vermiculite and perlite in gardening operations like tree planting operations. I visited a biochar making tree planting operation in Northern California that's making 1 million trees a year, and they use biochar that they make on site, and they save the money to make the kiln and so forth just on what they had been spending on perlite that had to come from China. So, that's don't worry about too much. Tons. It'd be fine, yeah? But probably it's going to be as much as you can afford to do. And it adds every year. It doesn't go away, so.
Well, I want to just thank you again for what I think was a real cool presentation. Thank you much.